What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown and this is Heresy Financial. Last month I made a video where I let you guys know how much money the federal government is making from taxes, because despite what you might think, they actually made a ton of money in taxes during 2020 to the point where it was a record. They made more taxes during 2020 than they had made in prior years, and this year they're set to even break 2020's record. And I told you that May would be the month to pay attention to, as it would give us more of an indication into what the actual tax receipts were, because May is the deadline, even though some people are still paying in April. And so we're going to look at those May numbers to show how much of a raise the federal government was able to give themselves by causing so much inflation that they give themselves a raise through tax revenue, even without tax rates going up. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, guys, let's dive into this chart here. And I'm just going to throw this up on the screen so that you can see it the entire time that we are talking about it. Basically, this is a chart that shows the month-by-month amount that the federal government gets in total tax revenues. And April was an okay month, but when you look at the spikes and you look at the peaks that happen every single year, those are the tax deadline months. That's when most of the tax revenue comes in for the year. Now, this is always in April except for last year, because they extended the tax filing deadline until July, and so last year that spike happened in July. And like I said, biggest month on record, and 2020 was the biggest year on record as well. Now, last month we got the information for April, and you can see here, April, federal government pulled in $439 billion, which was the highest amount of money that the government had made in tax revenue on a non-deadline month. But you were probably thinking, and I don't remember if I outright said it, but you might be thinking, hey, well, that's not really fair, because there were a lot of people that were paying their taxes in April, even though they weren't due until May, because it's just 1 month. It wasn't like 2020 where everybody was scared and put it off until July. And fair enough. And so I said we needed to wait and see what the May numbers were like. And this is why it's particularly scary, because it's not actually a huge difference than April. You're not going to see this year one of those massive spikes for a 1 month with a ton of revenue. In May, the total federal tax receipts were $463 billion. But when you add the two together, which is important, because normally all this money would come in during 1 month, this year it was spread between 2 months. When you add the two together, they are an astounding $902 billion. Again, last year, during 2020, federal tax receipts, the record month was July, the tax filing deadline. That was a record $563 billion. This year, $902 billion, almost $1 trillion. Now, you might also be looking at this and thinking, hey, wait, that's not a fair comparison, because right now you're taking money that would normally come in the tax filing deadline month and adding some money that would normally have happened during the month prior anyway, because we're looking at total of April plus total of May. And okay, fair enough. So in order to have this be a proper comparison, we should go back and look at prior years, the tax filing deadline month, and add in the prior month in order to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. Get whatever usually comes in the month prior to the tax filing deadline plus whatever usually comes in the tax filing deadline month. So we know this year, I added up already for you for 2021, $902 billion. For 2020, the number comes out to $803 billion. That's July and June. For 2019, April and March, you get $763 billion. 2018, you get $720 billion. 2017, you get $671 billion. And 2016, you get $665 billion. So that is the last 5 years of the tax filing deadline month, plus the revenue that came in from the month before it as well. That means this year, we have, for those numbers, those 2 months combined, we have the biggest year-over-year jump in federal tax receipts, and it's almost $100 billion more than it was last year. And here are the points. This is why I'm bringing this up and why I think it's so important to look at the real numbers. Number one, nobody's going to be talking about this. Nobody's talking about the fact that the government has given themselves massive raises every single year, especially during COVID, and nobody's going to notice how much money the government has made during 2021 until after 2021 is over. The second point is that this is why central banks cause inflation. Central banks do not prevent inflation. Central banks cause inflation on purpose, by design, intentionally, purposefully. This is also why central planners are so scared of deflation, because if prices go up, government revenue goes up. It's that simple, because a 20% tax is worth a higher dollar amount if you're cutting that 20% off the top of a total higher dollar amount. So if asset prices like stocks or real estate go up in price, if wages go up in price, if economic activity, total economic activity, increases in total dollar amount, tax revenues go up, and this is the key, you do not need to increase tax rates. You leave the same percentages, and as long as you increase the total dollars, then a larger amount gets back into the government's hands. All you have to do is push new dollars out into the economy. That drives prices up, which increases your tax revenue. Now, here's the catch-22 though. For many decades, most monetary expansion was driven mainly, at least during short-term cycles, by banks. And this is why people say QE is deflationary, not inflationary, that the Federal Reserve doesn't actually print money and blah, 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 because all they're looking at is the banks. The banks aren't really lending, but guess what? It doesn't matter. The government is going around the banks. If the banks aren't going to expand the money supply, the government does it for them. All the government has to do is increase their debt, they borrow a lot more, and guess who's lending to the government? It's the Federal Reserve. What is the government doing with all that money? They're spending it. So monetary expansion is happening without the banks. They're going around the banks. So you don't need banks to be lending to have inflation, to have monetary expansion, when the government will just go around them and spend money into the economy instead. But that's why it's a catch-22, is because the federal government is increasing their debt load, their total nominal debt amount, in order to spend money into the economy, in order to drive prices up, in order to increase their tax revenues, to make their debt burden lighter, but they had to increase their debt in order to do that. And so you have this cycle of diminishing returns where you increase your debt, thinking that at some point that's going to come back around and make it easier to pay off your debt, which in past decades that does work out, but it works less and less and less as time goes on, as your debt burden gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Because a dollar of increased debt doesn't come back and pay you an extra dollar in taxes. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, and we don't know where this tipping point is, we don't know where the invisible line in the sand is, but at some point, an extra dollar of debt won't produce any additional tax revenue because it's diminishing your returns. And that, my friends, is the end of the road. That is when you wind up with nowhere left to kick that can. When the burden of supporting and maintaining the tumor, the cancer, that massive growth that is the government sucking all of those resources out of the economy, as that burden just becomes so heavy that it collapses the structure of the economy underneath its own weight. And hopefully at that point, we'll be smart enough not to repeat the process and do it all over again. But don't get me wrong here. It's not all doom and gloom. You can still at this point exchange your dollars for stocks, for gold, for silver, for Bitcoin, for real estate. And that's what all of the big money is doing. If you'd like to do the same, you don't know where to start, I've got all of my recommended services, tools, resources linked in the description below. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.